Coming to mineral metabolism. So in this metabolism, first we'll discuss about calcium. So calcium is the most important mineral in our body. So when you see the sources of calcium, they are milk and milk products. So they are the rich sources for the calcium. And what is the RDA? What is the daily requirement of calcium? It is 500 mg in case of adults. In case of children, it is 1200 mg milligrams per day, and in case of pregnancy and lactation, the requirement increases. It will be 1500 milligrams per day. So that's about the daily requirement of calcium. And factors affecting the calcium absorption. There are some factors which affect the absorption of calcium. So there are some factors which increase the absorption, helping the increased absorption of calcium, and there are some factors which decrease the absorption of calcium. So collectively we call them as factors affecting calcium absorption. So what are those factors? So first we'll see factors increasing the calcium absorption. So that is vitamin D. Calcitriol increases the absorption of calcium. Parathyroid hormone PTH increases the calcium absorption. Acidity favors the calcium absorption, and lysine and arginine, these two amino acids, they favor the absorption of calcium. Whereas there are some factors which decrease the absorption of calcium. Those are phytates, phytic acid, oxalates, and malabsorption syndromes. So any malabsorption syndrome, it leads to decreased absorption of calcium, and apart from that we have phosphate. So these are the factors which are decreasing the calcium absorption. Now coming to functions of calcium, it is very important mineral. So the most important, these are the important functions of calcium you can see. So those are activation of enzymes. Calcium is required for the activation of enzymes like pyruvate kinase, pyruvate dehydrogenase, right? So these are the important phospholipase C. So like this, it is involved in the activation of some enzymes, and there is one protein called as calmodulin. So when that enzyme, so calmodulin is activated when calcium binds with calmodulin. So calmodulin only exists as active when calcium binds with calmodulin. So in this way, it mediates the activation of enzymes. So that is one role of calcium. Coming to muscle contraction. So whenever neuron signal reaches the muscle, then the calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that calcium activates a protein ATPase. Then that ATPase increases the attraction between the actin and myosin, that leads to excitation contraction coupling. So that's how it leads to muscle contraction and helps in the muscle contraction. And coming to bone and teeth formation, the most important mineral required for the bone and teeth formation is calcium. And coming to another function, coagulation. So there are some coagulation factors. So this calcium is called as a coagulation factors. So because for the activation of some important coagulation factors, we require calcium, right? So that's how the role of calcium in coagulation. The second messenger, calcium acts as a second messenger, you can compare with that of cyclic AMP. As it acts as second messenger, calcium also acts as second messenger. Yeah. Coming to myocardium, its effect on heart. So calcium prolongs the systole. So sudden intravenous injection of calcium leads to heart stops in the systole. So whenever there is sudden infusion of calcium, intravenous infusion of calcium, so that is the effect of calcium on the myocardium. So it leads to cardiac arrest in the systole. Heart stops in systole. And coming to nerve conduction, so calcium is also involved in the nerve conduction signals for the transmission of signals from the postsynaptic region to the presynaptic region. So with presynaptic region to the postsynaptic region, we require calcium. So in this way, it is required in the nerve conduction. Coming to another important function, secretion of hormones. Secretion of hormones like calcitonin, parathyroid hormone. So those are mediated by calcium. So these are the important functions of calcium. And coming to factors regulating the blood calcium level. So normal blood calcium level is 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. So this level 9 to 11 is maintained by three important factors. Those are vitamin D, calcitriol. Second factor is parathyroid hormone and the other one is calcitonin. So these three will affect the calcium level, right? So when you see vitamin D, it increases the blood calcium level. So vitamin D, the active form of vitamin D, we call it as calcitriol. So that calcitriol increases synthesis of a protein called as calbindin, and that calbindin is involved in the absorption of calcium from the intestine. So by increasing the calbindin synthesis, vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium, so that ultimately it increases the calcium level in the blood. Right. So that is the effect of vitamin D on calcium level. So apart from the next factor is parathyroid hormone. So this parathyroid hormone, so it also increases the blood calcium level. So by increasing its absorption, indirectly by increasing the synthesis of calcitriol. So it activates the enzyme called as 1-alpha hydroxylase, which is involved in the conversion of calcidiol into calcitriol. So when the activity of that enzyme in the kidney is increased, so then more amount of calcitriol is synthesized, and that calcitriol increases the synthesis of calbindin, and in this way parathyroid hormone increases the absorption of calcium indirectly. Apart from that, parathyroid hormone is also involved in the mobilization of calcium from the bone. So it increases the bone resorption, demineralization of bone is brought by this parathyroid hormone. That is how parathyroid hormone influences the calcium level. It affects the blood calcium level. Coming to another factor, calcitonin, we have seen that vitamin D and parathyroid hormone, they increase the blood calcium level, whereas calcitonin, it has antagonist to these two factors. So those two will increase the calcium level, whereas calcitonin, it decreases the calcium level. So it increases the mineralization of the bone, right? So it deposits that calcium, uses that calcium for the bone formation. So this is how calcitonin is involved in the it affects the calcium level. That is, its effect is it tries to decrease the blood calcium level, whereas vitamin D and parathyroid hormone, they increase the blood calcium level. This is the effect of factors on the blood calcium level. So those factors are vitamin D, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. So disorders of calcium. So whenever the calcium level is more than 11 milligrams per deciliter, we call it as hypercalcemia. Whenever it is less than 9 milligrams per deciliter, we call it as hypocalcemia. So generally when it is less than 8.5 milligrams per deciliter, we call it as hypocalcemia. Coming to disorders, so hypercalcemia means there is increased calcium level in the blood, that is more than 11 milligrams per deciliters. So what causes the increased calcium level? Hyperparathyroidism. Whenever the activity of parathyroid gland is more, then more amount of PTH is secreted, and that influences the calcium level in such a way that it increases the blood calcium level. So that is the effect of parathyroid hormone on the calcium level. So what are the symptoms of hypercalcemia? So when you see there is neuromuscular features like there is muscle weakness, tiredness. So those are the important neuromuscular features seen in case of hypercalcemia. And apart from that, we have one more feature, psychiatric. So those persons who have hypercalcemia, so they have confusion, right, agitation. So those are the important features of psychiatric features in case of hypercalcemia. And coming to renal features, in case of renal features, there is increased excretion of urine, polyuria is seen. Apart from that, formation of renal calicula is also seen in case of hypercalcemia. And the manifestations concerned with the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract are, so there is vomiting, constipation seen in case of hypercalcemia. And coming to cardiovascular manifestations, so we discussed that whenever there is increased calcium, it affects the heart. So in case of hypercalcemia, it leads to arrhythmias. So that is the effect of hypercalcemia on cardiovascular system. and there is arrhythmia in case of hypercalcemia. So this is about the hypercalcemia. So what causes hypercalcemia and what are the important features or symptoms of the hypercalcemia? Coming to hypocalcemia. So we discussed that whenever it is less than 9 milligrams per deciliter, we call it as hypocalcemia. So hypocalcemia is because of hypoparathyroidism and vitamin D deficiency, renal diseases. So these are the causes for the hypocalcemia. In case of hypocalcemia, the important feature of hypocalcemia is tetany. So there is carpopedal spasms in case of tetany. Apart from that, there is positive Romberg sign, positive Chostek sign are the important features of tetany. That's about the calcium. We have seen what are the sources, RDA, what are the important functions of calcium, and what is the normal level, what are the factors affecting the calcium level, how this, what happens whenever the calcium level is more than its range, that is hypercalcemia and hypocalcemia. Coming to next most important mineral, iron. So the total iron content in the body is 3 to 5 grams. And what are the sources of iron? The dietary sources of iron are green leafy vegetables. Those are the important dietary sources. Apart from that, we have pulses, cereals, and jaggery is a very good source of iron. So that's about the sources of iron. Coming to RDA, how much amount of iron is required per day? So the daily requirement is, in case of iron is, we require, in case of adults it is 20 milligrams per day, and when you see, so in case of children, the requirement, so in the age of 13 to 15 years, the requirement is 20 to 30 milligrams per day, and in case of pregnancy, the requirement increases and it is around 40 milligrams per day. So this is about the requirement of iron, 20 milligrams in case of adults, and in case of children, the requirement is 20 to 30, pregnancy 40 milligrams per day. Coming to iron absorption, as we have seen in case of calcium absorption, so there are some factors which increase or decrease the absorption of calcium. Same way, there are some factors which influence the iron absorption also, and the factors which increase the iron absorption are vitamin C, HCl, and sulfur containing amino acid like cysteine, and proteins with the sulfhydryl groups. So all these factors, they increase the iron absorption, they favor the iron absorption. So there are some factors which decrease the iron absorption, phytates, oxalates, and apart from that we have another factors like calcium, lead. So these factors, they decrease the calcium absorption. And when you see, the most important aspect of iron metabolism and iron absorption is, so it is regulated at the level of absorption, right? So other nutrients, they have regulation at the level of absorption, excretion, but it is regulated only at the level of absorption. And this type of regulation in case of iron is called as mucosal block, right? So that mucosal block type of regulation is seen. Mucosal block theory is nothing but the regulation of iron at the level of absorption, not at the level of excretion, right? So that is the important feature of iron absorption, right? So means the cellular requirements will decide the iron absorption. Whenever the requirement is more, then the absorption of iron is increased. Whenever the requirement is less, the absorption of iron is decreased. So you are regulating the iron levels only at the stage of absorption, not at the excretion stage. So that is the important aspect of iron absorption explained by mucosal block theory. And for that absorption, we require a protein called as divalent metal transporter. So that transports the iron from the intestinal lumen into the intestinal mucosal cells. So those, for the transport, we require this DMT1, divalent metal transporter. And that is the use of that DMT. So once it is transferred into the mucosal cells, it may be stored in that mucosal cell as ferritin. Right? Otherwise, it is transported to the liver. It is transported in the blood with the help of transferrin. Right? So from mucosal cell, it enters into the blood. So in the blood, that iron binds with apotransferrin and is converted into transferrin. So for the incorporation of iron into the apotransferrin, we have to convert that iron from the ferrous state to ferric state. So absorption of iron occurs only in the form of ferrous state, whereas its incorporation occurs in the form of ferric state. So for that conversion of ferrous state of iron into ferric state of iron requires ceruloplasmin, a copper containing enzyme called as ceruloplasmin is required in the conversion of ferrous form to ferric form. So that ferric form is now reacts with apoferritin, that is converted into transferrin. Right? So apoferritin is a, what do you call it, is a protein part of the transferrin, apotransferrin, and the non-protein part here it is iron. So those two form the transferrin. That transferrin transports the iron to the tissues, target tissues. Right. So that is how transport occurs, and those tissues, most of the tissues, they have receptors for the transferrin, and that transferrin receptor complex is internalized, and thereby so that iron reaches to the enters to the target tissues and cells. And coming to storage, so this iron, whatever that is absorbed, it is stored in the body in the form of ferritin, right? And the other form in which it is stored is hemosiderin. Right? So the truncated form of ferritin is nothing but hemosiderin. It has less protein part, so that when compared to ferritin, so that is the difference between ferritin and hemosiderin. These are the two important storage forms of the iron. These two are stored mainly in case of liver, spleen, and bone marrow. Coming to functions, what are the functions of iron? Functions of iron is its tissue respiration. And when you see the components of electron transport chain, they have cytochromes, iron sulfur proteins. So that iron sulfur proteins complexes, they have iron. So in this way, so this iron is required in the respiration, cellular respiration. So apart from that, it is involved in the transport of gases. When you take hemoglobin, myoglobin, all these proteins, they have iron, and the function, without iron they cannot transport the gases. So that is the other function of iron. And coming to oxidative reactions, so for example catalase, superoxide dismutase, so these enzymes, oxidative enzymes, they require this iron. So in this way this is involved in the oxidative reactions. And apart from that, detoxification, there is one most important enzyme in the liver which is involved in the detoxification reactions, that is cytochrome P450. So that cytochrome P450 has iron. So that's how it plays role in the detoxification process. So these are the functions of iron. Coming to deficiency manifestations of iron, so this is most commonly seen in India, iron deficiency anemia. And so what happens in case of, mostly seen in case of women than the males, right? And what are the deficiency manifestations of iron deficiency? So in case of iron deficiency, so the important features are apathy, a lack of concentration, and memory loss, and attention deficit is there. So impaired attention, impaired memory, achlorohydria, apathy, lack of interest. These are the important features of iron deficiency anemia. So, and apart from that, it leads to, as I told you, so whenever there is deficiency of iron, so iron cannot be used for the, as you know, iron is required for the synthesis of heme, and without iron, heme cannot be synthesized. That leads to anemia. Iron overload. So whenever you take excess amount of iron, that leads to a condition called as iron overload. Hemosiderosis and hemochromatosis are the two forms of iron load. Right. So hemochromatosis is nothing but you call it as bronze diabetes. So what is bronze diabetes? That iron gets deposited in the pancreas and it leads to pancreatitis. It affects the pancreatic tissues, and it gets deposited in the liver, right? it affects the liver tissue, damages the liver tissue, damages the pancreatic tissue, and it gets deposited in the skin. Under the skin we can see the deposition of iron. So these three features together we call it as bronch diabetes. Right? So that's about iron. Now coming to copper metabolism. So this copper requirement is 1.5 to 3 milligrams per day. So that is the requirement of copper. And when you see the sources of copper are cereals, meat, liver, leafy vegetables. These are the important sources of copper. So milk is a poor source of copper. And coming to its blood level, the concentration of copper in the blood is 100 milligrams per deciliter. And copper is bound to a particular protein in the blood that is called as copper binding protein, ceruloplasmin. So that ceruloplasmin is a copper containing protein, and its level in the blood is 25 to 50 milligrams per deciliter. So this is the most important enzyme required in the absorption of iron, ceruloplasmin, which has peroxidase activity. Coming to functions of copper. So this copper, as you know, so as I told you, it is required in the iron absorption because it converts ferrous form of iron into ferric form of iron. That is why, so it is involved in the iron absorption. So one of the functions is iron absorption. Another function is tyrosinase activity. So in the metabolism of tyrosine, we require this tyrosinase. This tyrosinase requires copper as its cofactor. So that's how it is required in tyrosine activity. Coming to cellular respiration, so the components of electron transport chain, they have copper, so that's how it plays role in the cellular respiration. And cofactor of vitamin C in hydroxylation reactions. So there are some post-translational modifications in case of collagen, where collagen elastin, where hydroxylation occurs after synthesis of protein, and those hydroxylation reactions are brought by require the coenzyme vitamin C, and that vitamin C requires copper. So that's how it plays role in the hydroxylation reactions. So these are the important functions of copper. And what happens in the deficiency of copper? It leads to, coming to disorders of copper metabolism, Wilson's disease. So whenever there is excess copper in the blood, it leads to copper overload, and that disease we call it as Wilson's disease. So this is because of deficiency of a particular enzyme called as ATPase. So that copper binding ATPase deficiency leads to decreased excretion of copper through bile, and that leads to increased excretion of copper in the blood. We call it as Wilson's disease. That's how copper overload occurs in case of Wilson disease. And the level of ceruloplasmin is also decreased because coming to there is copper deposition in the liver and brain. So that's why Wilson's disease is called as Wilson's hepatolenticular degeneration. So in case of Wilson disease, there is hepatolenticular degeneration. So because it copper gets deposited in liver and brain. And coming to copper deficiency anemia. So as I told you, copper is involved in the iron absorption. Whenever there is deficiency of copper, so that iron cannot be absorbed, it leads to deficiency of iron, and that leads to anemia. So that's how copper deficiency is related to the anemia. So we call it as copper deficiency anemia. Apart from that, the key enzyme of heme synthesis, ALA synthase, has copper in the structure, and without copper, the activity of ALA synthase will be decreased, and that leads to anemia. And the type of anemia seen in case of copper deficiency is microcytic hypochromic, microcytic normochromic anemia is seen in case of copper deficiency. Another disorder in case of copper metabolism is cardiovascular diseases. So as I told you, this is required in the post-translational modification, that is hydroxylation. In case of elastin, that hydroxylation reaction requires copper. Right? So without copper, that cannot form the proper elastin, and that leads to rupture of valves, and that results in the cardiovascular diseases. So that is the effect of copper on the cardiovascular system. So copper, without copper, crosslinks cannot be formed. that is the main feature in case of copper deficiency, that is manifested as cardiovascular diseases. So another disorder in case of copper metabolism is Menkes kinky hair syndrome. Here this affects only male child, not the females. Only male childs are affected by this in this disorder, Menkes kinky hair disease. So here also there is defective copper binding ATPase activity. So that's how it leads to this Menkes kinky hair syndrome. Right. Apart from that, the another important feature of copper deficiency is melanin. So tyrosinase requires copper for its activity. Whenever there is deficiency of copper, tyrosinase cannot convert tyrosine into melanin, and without deficiency of melanin leads to condition hypopigmentation. So that's how it leads to a flag type of hair in case of copper deficiency. Right? So this is the effect of copper on melanin synthesis. Yeah. So that's about the copper metabolism. Coming to zinc. So when you see, so total zinc in the body is 2 grams. Total iron in the body is 3 to 5 grams. Here zinc is 2 grams. So sources of zinc are, so this is present in beans, nuts, cereals, cheese, shellfish. So these are the important sources of eggs. So these are the important sources of zinc. Right. Come to RDA, the requirement of zinc per day in case of adults is 10 milligrams per day, and in case of children it is 10 milligrams per day, and in case of pregnancy and lactation the requirement increases, that is 15 to 20 milligrams is required in case of pregnancy and lactation. Coming to functions of zinc, so this zinc is required for the activity of many enzymes. Over 300 enzymes they require zinc for their activity, and this zinc is required, it acts as an antioxidant because superoxide dismutase, which is involved in the detoxification of free radicals. So that superoxide dismutase requires zinc for its activity. In this way we can say that zinc acts as an antioxidant. Right? Apart from that, there is stabilization of insulin brought by the zinc. So insulin in the beta cells of the pancreas is stored in association with zinc. The storage form of insulin has zinc. Right? That's another important function of zinc in the stabilization of the insulin, storage of insulin. Coming to deficiencies manifestations. So whenever there is deficiency of zinc, it leads to poor bone healing, and there is loss of hair is in case of zinc deficiency. There is dermatitis. So apart from that, there is impaired spermatogenesis. So abnormal sperms are synthesized in case of zinc deficiency. And another important mineral is fluoride. So fluoride, actually the normal requirement is 1 ppm, 1 parts per billion is required, and fluorosis results. So whenever the intake is more than 1 ppm, whenever the intake is more than 2 ppm, then we'll see so intestinal manifestations. There is weight loss, there is intestinal upset is there. Apart from that, there is loss of appetite. So that results in the weight loss. Right? So these are the features when the intake is more than 2 ppm. So when the intake is more than 5 ppm, so mainly you can see mottling of enamel and discoloration of the teeth is seen in case whenever there is a requirement is whenever you have taken the fluoride more than 5 ppm. So discoloration of the teeth, mottling of enamel and stratification of the teeth is seen in case of more than 5 ppm. And coming to whenever the intake is more than 20 ppm, it leads to a condition called as genuvalgum. So that is fluorosis. We call that condition as genuvalgum. So in that condition there is osteoporosis, osteosclerosis is seen. There is increased bone density is seen in case of whenever the intake is more than 20 ppm. Right? And that leads to brittle bones. The risk of fractures increases in case of genuvalgum fluorosis. So that's about minerals. So we discussed about calcium, iron, zinc, and copper and fluoride. Thank you.